Is this the real life, or is this just a fictional reality? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Fictional Reality. Now, this is going to be episode 3 in the release schedule, but 5 in the order of recording, which means you will hear a little bit of achronism coming forward. That's just due to me being a strange time traveler, and I like to do things to shake things up a little bit. So, this week I have a wonderful guest by the name of Rita from PostCurious. She has just released a epic looking game called The Emerald Flame. The Emerald Flame, it's a narrative puzzle tabletop adventure extraordinaire. There's puzzles, there's beautiful artwork, there's a mythical story about an alchemist and a comet, and it's very cool. And we have a pretty cool conversation about it. We talk about narrative and puzzle design, simplicity and complexity, how to engage players, and she, of course, shares a few little tips and tricks and moments of insight along the way. It's a good little episode. Without much further ado, let's just crack right into it. Thank you very much. Alrighty. Rita, thank you for coming on the show. Another episode of Fictional Reality where I speak to experienced designers about how they craft experiences for people. You're a puzzle narrative designer. You have just created something called the Emerald Flame. It's gone bonanza on Kickstarter. You have been marketing this for ages. You've been tantalizing us with puzzles online. You have a really unique artistic style, which is super eye-catching. And the Kickstarter is appropriately going successfully. So for anyone who is watching or listening, there's a link to it in the bio. Check it out. It's a beautiful piece of work in an artistic way, but it's also a narrative puzzle adventure, which is really what tweaked my curiosity, is the idea of folding in a narrative into the Emerald Flame, like that it's very narratively guided by the looks of things. Can you tell us a bit about what is the narrative of the Emerald Flame?
Sure. So the narrative of the Emerald Flame revolves around the story of an alchemist in the 1400s, and basically her relationship with a friend of hers and this sort of political unrest at the time with the church, and trying to create find ingredients for a mysterious potion and put that together in order to create something very powerful that might change the world.
That might help. Very cool. Yeah, it's got these great elements of, there's a mythical element to it. And I feel like the world of this narrative is perfectly suited to puzzles. Now, the player themselves is involved in the narrative. They're part of, how do you say, is it the Kosher Society?
So the player is basically commissioned by the Kosher Society as a historical expert to examine these documents and objects that they found and try to find the connections between them, figure out what they mean, and basically you submit your solutions to them and they will help you move on into the next part of the game.
So this is very cool. When you look at the Kickstarter, there's so much stuff, so many things to play with, so many pieces of paper and little puzzle things. Where did all of this begin? What was the first step
The
on this
catalyst.
journey? Yeah.
So I think there's sort of two steps that came together, and one of them I was literally just looking up undeciphered ciphers on Wikipedia, and one of them was in the Voynich manuscript, which is a really cool thing, and if you have never seen it, go look it up right now. The
Mm-hmm.
entire thing is available online, but it's basically this crazy book full of several folios that have all these plant drawings and astronomical diagrams, all kinds of fun stuff. And it turned out that at some point it had belonged to someone in Prague. And it also turned out that there's a lot of sort of alchemical related history in Prague. So I started digging into that, and that's kind of basically that's developed into what it is now, and it's gone through a few different versions, inspired by various things. One of the things actually that drew me to Prague was the astronomical clock, So for a while, the game was centered around that, but it ended up um, being more about the alchemist.
Mm. What is the astronomical clock?
It's a clock in the middle of the old town square, and it shows time in, I'm not sure how many ways, maybe seven or something like that. It's got like the old Gregorian calendar, it's got like regular time, it has the date, it's got like um the the horoscope that we're currently in, and then it's got like a sun time and a moon phase. It's just, it's a crazy clock. Also, if you haven't seen it, just Google it right now. It looks awesome.
That is cool. I did not know about this crazy clock that can do all these different things. As a time traveler myself, I'm very interested in clocks from the 20th century. Um, I could go on a big tangent about that, about all the different
Yeah.
calendars and the interesting thing how we all sort of live second to second, but we live in these like contextual frameworks of time. And anyway, it doesn't matter. So when was this? When did you first, I know you had the Tale of Ord. That was your initial, you kickstarted
Mhm.
that?
I did not kickstart that actually.
Oh,
It was the first game, but I didn't do a Kickstarter for it. And that was finished in May of 2018 was
mm,
when I released it. So I've pretty much been working on this since I finished that game.
right. And when you say working on it, you like have done pretty much everything except physically cut out the acrylic yourself. Is that correct? Like you've you've done all the artwork, all of the designing work. I'm sure other people have helped along the way, but let's talk a little bit about your process. You seem to be a skilled artist. How long have you been doing that? How has that um, come to be?
Art?
Yeah.
That's probably my oldest skill, really. I wanted to be an artist since I was like 3 years old. So I've been doing art for a really long time, but sort of on and off. Like at some point in high school, I did a lot of painting, but never did watercolor. I was actually terrible at watercolor,
Right.
interestingly enough.
Hmm.
And this whole game is illustrated in watercolor. And yeah, I actually used to want to be an illustrator, and I ended up going to school for furniture design.
Hmm.
So started working in 3 dimensions instead, and kind of got into the more puzzly aspect of things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it was, I guess, maybe it was fall of that year when I started working on this that I did Inktober, which for anyone who doesn't know, illustrators will often post a drawing a day during the month of October. And at the time, I was like, I think this will be good. I should practice drawing, and like it'll be nice to get back into it. And I actually really enjoyed it, and then I decided to uh, illustrate the game in the watercolors that I was just sort of starting to get into at the time.
Mm.
And yeah, it's actually been one of my favorite things about working on this game is, because sometimes you spend so much time figuring out puzzles and like breaking your brain on
Mm-hmm.
things, and then you just sit down and like draw some flowers, and it's a good counterpoint.
You secretly like put in a therapeutic exercise within a very confusing type framework there of
Yeah.
drawing flowers, and they look lovely. Um, what was I going to say? So you have something that really caught my eye. The first thing that caught my eye from PostCurious was, I can't even remember how I started following you. I think it was just on Instagram, just like through recommendations. And you have a slightly Art Deco-y design, and I thought it was cool. But the first thing that really caught my eye was a puzzle that was like a ring of circles, and they were different colored circles, and they overlapped on
Oh
each
yeah.
other.
Hmm.
Um, and so, and I just, I'm not a huge puzzle player myself, but I had not really seen a puzzle like that before. One where it was very like just image based, and I really enjoyed that it was so. It was just it contained so few letters and words on it. And then there was another one which I didn't solve, and I threw it to my escape room friends, and we've had a bit of trouble with it. But it was a bit more. I think
Was it the octagon one?
it it might have been the octagon. There was I just remember there was an overlap of like a wheel and a chair, and I think it implied the
Oh,
answer
that
was
one.
like a wheelchair.
Yes.
And is that the answer? Is it a wheelchair
Well,
meant to?
well, it's not the answer. I mean, it's the answer to that part of the puzzle,
Right, right.
essentially.
It's a tenth of
Yeah.
the answer or whatever. And I was just like hooked on that concept, and I just loved it. I thought, wow, this is so cool. I've never really seen like it's just very visually simple, but there's like some nice complexity to it. Um, how did you arrive? Start with this specific puzzle. How did you come up with this concept? Yeah, how did you come up with the concept for those two specific puzzles?
I actually just like wrote a blog post about those particular puzzles.
Cool.
Um, and basically like this is true for a lot of the puzzles in the Emerald Flame. A lot of them were inspired by alchemical drawings that I'd just found on the internet.
Mm,
And, they're full of words and symbols that I don't know the meaning of. So, was sort of an exercise in, well, this looks interesting. What can I make out of these shapes that could
mm,
be a puzzle? And that's kind of, I mean, I think that happens a lot in my process where I'll just see things and I'm like, this could be a puzzle. um,
absolutely.
and so for those particular ones, it was actually, there was one um, drawing, and it was, I don't actually know what it was, but underneath that drawing, there were three other teeny drawings that were really blurry because it was not a very high resolution picture. So I zoomed in on those, and like you could kind of just make out some shapes, but you couldn't even make out like what letters were there. It was so blurry.
Mm,
And so I just kind of took those shapes and drew them on a piece of paper and started seeing what I could come up with. And one of them had um, it kind of looked like it had two sides that then could combine into one thing that was in between them.
right.
So the wheelchair puzzle that you're describing also has words with words between them, and the between words are the combination of the wheel and the chair.
Mm.
So that was the origin of that.
Well, it was very ingenious, and I'll admit it's a small thing, but that sold me on the Emerald Flame. Like I've then clicked through. I was like, who made this? Who made this puzzle? And then I found your website, and then I found your blog, which is just like insanely like you do a lot of work. You're a I don't know if you have this term over there, but it's a term of endearment, a workhorse.
we call them workaholics. We
Work
really,
right.
I mean, workhorse too, but I think
You need your
workaholic.
workahole.
Exactly. Yeah, honestly, I never knew how long it would take to write blog posts until I started it. So
It's
I have
crazy.
I have a newfound respect for people who write a lot of posts.
Yeah, well, you've got a whole post on there on glue. Um,
Glue is so great to talk about. I love talking about glue.
why? What's your favorite glue?
My favorite glue is it's called Zap-A-Gap, and
Hmm.
it's basically like a super glue, but it's just the best super glue that you've ever tried.
Well, look, as someone who has used glue in a lot of different situations, oh, you would have worked with a lot of glue in furniture design?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I used to be in guitar and instrument restoration. So
Mm,
it's
a lot of glue there too.
a lot of glue, and very important that you know the differences between glue and timber and humidity and how glues age and how they dry and flexibility and all this sorts of thing.
Yeah.
So I was like well accustomed to glue, and then I shifted from timber to paper, and sort of took my mentality to how I worked with timber to paper, and like, oh, paper is like it is a very thin form of timber, and you
Hmm.
can use it in some similar ways. You can't fold timber, but you can fold paper, so they have these differences. But glue came up again as this like super important thing. Oh, it's okay if you have people in the background. I'll blur them out. Um, it's and then yeah, glue became important yet again. And I was like, oh, this is actually a whole different world of things, because now the glue ruins the paper if I want it to do. Anyway, you have a passion for what you do. That's quite clear through your blog posts, which are super informative. And I'm going to link that down uh, in the description beneath us in the show notes for anyone listening. Go check out Rita's blog, because you seem to keep it pretty updated. You've updated it pretty regularly every month for the past, what, 18 months or year or
Maybe.
so?
I don't know if it's, I don't have no idea how long it's been. I've been trying to do 2 posts a month, but yeah.
I know it's not easy. And I always go into it thinking, oh, yeah, I'll just like put something down. It doesn't often work out that way. It
No.
like, I will
I
think
mean,
about
for
the
me,
blog.
it's like when I finally have an idea, then I just spill out the whole thing all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden. Like sometimes I'm planning on working on something else, and then I just start thinking about a topic. I'm like, I guess I could write about this, and then I just write for like an hour.
um, and so you run your website. Are you doing anything else other than the Emerald Flame through PostCurious at the moment, or has just all your attention been on Emerald Flame?
It's all been on Emerald Flame for the most part. I have a couple projects that I'm just barely starting on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very excited about those, but they're in their seed phases right now.
Right. Cool. Well, I'm gonna go into your sort of design process for the Emerald Flame in just a second, but just give us a bit of a rundown. Outside of PostCurious, you work a full-time job as well. Is that right?
Yes, at the moment. Working from home at the moment as we've all been inside.
Cool. And so, in between, after, before work, you then have been creating this puzzle for the past since 2018, so 2 years.
Hmm.
Um, let's talk a little bit about the sort of the design process and how, because I'm really interested. A limitation of mine is sort of getting things made, outsourcing things, getting things laser cut, adding components to my puzzles that I can't physically do myself or that have to be done at scale. So you've found this Voynich manuscript. It's inspired you, and you've started creating this tale. Um, Run me through the process of how you started putting the Emerald Flame together. So you're inspired by the narrative. What do the puzzles do? How do the puzzles serve what you're trying to do, and how do they even come into the thing? Why not just make your own Voynich manuscript? Why make a specific puzzle adventure?
Well, I think the question is why make it the Voynich manuscript rather than just a puzzle adventure? It's the opposite question.
Right.
Um, well, I started by doing a lot of research just about the location, the time period, and tried to like find details that I thought were interesting that I could maybe incorporate into the story and kind of work the puzzles around that. And the story, was pretty malleable. It changed a lot as it went along, depending on what made more sense with the puzzles as they evolved.
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually I landed on this, which is basically you're trying to figure out these ingredients that are needed to use for this potion.
Hmm.
And there's also a strange comet that's involved in consuming the potion. So
Mm.
you also have to find out some information about this comet. And I won't say too much more about it because I don't want to spoil the surprise for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, a lot of the puzzles developed just from the research that I found, whether it was information or pictures. And I also like using maps a lot. So there's a big map of Prague in there, and there's also a map of Prague Castle, which is where some of this action takes place.
Mm-hmm.
And I did go on a trip there, so I also took a lot of reference photos and stuff, and tried to work off of those, and basically just use the elements that I found to be interesting about the city and incorporate those into puzzles. And there's definitely like some historical um, elements to it, but it's sort of like a fantasy history where
Right.
you don't necessarily really know which of these things actually happened or not. And it's kind of fun to work on it that way, because there are also like really local legends that are probably didn't really happen, but are just interesting to read about. Like the astronomical clock, actually one of the reasons why I thought it was so interesting was that there was a legend that the person who first constructed it was then like blinded by some minions of the ruler at the time, because they didn't want them to go build as nice of a clock in any other city, because they wanted it to only be in Prague. And then this
Jesus.
clockmaker, in revenge, like broke the clock, and then it wasn't repaired for another 100 years or something like that. I mean, that's like the coolest story, right?
That's very cool and very typical of like like a greedy power of like, this clock you've made is beautiful. Pity if you were to do it anywhere else.
Yeah, exactly.
um, I had a very pertinent and accurate question to ask you based on everything you just said. And it has completely flown out of my head, which is fine. That's completely okay. So, how so something that has come up on this podcast. Oh, that's what I was going to say. This what you just spoke to about sort of incorporating history in a sort of subtleish way. Um, that is actually something I was interested. I created fictional reality to sort of speak to. Is that we have virtual reality and augmented reality, but there are things called fictional realities, which I think the first instance I saw of one was in the Da Vinci Code with Dan Brown, where he sort of took these real things, real historical artifacts that you could interact with in the real world, and then overlaid this sort of narrative onto them that took them into this sort of, this fictional reality where it's like, oh, imagine if it was pointing due east toward this other thing and so on. And so as a result, like I love that when I was younger, and have loved that concept and try and incorporate that sort of thing into what I do. So it's awesome to hear it pops up again when I talk to these narrative puzzle designers such as yourselves, who are interested in blurring these lines between the fictional and the reality. And funnily enough, in my experience, the more you look into it, the more you find pieces of reality that don't really make sense, like the Voynich manuscript, or you've probably seen the Serafina. I think I'm saying that wrong. The Serafina Codex. There's
I
this.
don't know if I'm familiar with that one.
It's similar to the Voynich
Oh wait,
manuscript.
yes, I okay. I know
Yeah,
which one
yeah.
you're talking
I think
about.
it was made pretty recently. The author is still alive, but yeah, it's basically aliens, and it's all written in this alien language, but no one can decode it, sort of thing. There are these strange examples of things in the real world, and I feel like these puzzles and narratives, they can remind us that the difference between fiction and reality usually can be pretty thin, and it can be hard to tell the difference between the two sometimes. But I'm getting off topic. So you have created this puzzle adventure, and now the puzzles are helping facilitate the story, and the story is working in with the puzzles. Now you're into the physical manufacture of the prototype.
Mm-hmm.
You have what looks like from the Kickstarter page, there's this cool acrylic-y type. It looks like acrylic. I could be wrong. It's transparent. it looks like glass type rotating thingy.
Hmm.
I'm really interested in, without obviously giving too many spoilers away, what is that? But also, how did that come from an idea in your head to something that became an element in the Kickstarter?
So it's inspired by an astrolabe, and which is an astronomical instrument to for navigating, basically, but a much more complicated one and actually practically useful, whereas this will not help you navigate anything. But the just the shapes of everything looked so beautiful that I wanted to make something that was um, basically its own kind of astronomical instrument that looked kind of like that. So without saying too much more about it, that is
Mm,
that is what
cool.
its purpose is, and that is what it is.
And how did you? So it's a laser cut thing. How did you go about getting that made physically?
Yeah, a lot of the parts, a bunch of the parts in the game are laser cut, and ultimately that's just it's kind of an easy way for me to prototype things.
Hmm.
Even though I do not have one myself, but I can send out parts to get cut, and it's easy enough to just draw some graphics, because if you're trying to make something that's three-dimensional, or made of wood or something like that, it's going to be a lot harder to find another way to make that happen. And particularly with something that was such a complicated shape,
Mm.
there wasn't really a whole lot of options. I actually started prototyping the very first time I tried to make that object. I cut that shape out of paper, and then it became immediately clear that it could not be opaque, because it was like you couldn't really solve the puzzle unless you could see through it easily enough.
Right.
um, so then I tried like printing it on plastic, but it just didn't really have the same effect, and the acrylic came out really nice, I think.
Yeah. It looks very whimsical, mystical, um, and the old worldy. So you have a whole bunch of physical components. You have created the puzzles, and you've interspersed the story. And just out of curiosity, is the story something that is written? Like, how do you deliver the story? Or if you can, again, don't give too much away, but how is the story delivered to the player?
It's basically delivered through letters.
Right.
So you have the puzzles in front of you. The puzzles have, most of them have their own little clue, but they are objects that this alchemist was accumulating, and she herself was trying to solve. So you're sort of putting yourself in her shoes and trying to figure out the things that she was trying to figure out. And meanwhile, you're reading her correspondence with her friend, detailing her adventures of trying to find these items
Mm.
and what she thinks that they might mean. And those are, to help clue you in a little bit on how to figure them out.
Ah, cool. And then within that correspondence is this sort of political unrest and a larger narrative about what's happening at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's a huge aspect of it. I think it's a little more focused on like the characters themselves, but it's definitely a driving force in the narrative,
Hmm.
because, like I said, a lot of the stuff happens in the castle, and in the middle of that castle is a big church.
Right.
So there was a lot happening within the church at the time, and different factions splitting off. So just a lot of conflict in that sense, and it's it's kind of in the background, but it's definitely important to what happens in the story.
Right. Right. Cool. So now you've got your story down, you got your puzzles down, you have your prototypes built. When do you start playtesting, and what does the playtesting journey sort of look like? Yeah, when do you start playtesting? We'll start there.
So I started. So I usually test out individual puzzles before I really put everything together.
Hmm.
So sometimes it just means like I make a sketch on a piece of paper and give it to somebody, and I'm like, okay, try to solve this.
Mm.
So I'll usually do that at least a couple times with every puzzle if it's feasible, before I put them all together. And it takes a while before I actually really get the whole thing to a tester, because I want to get it to a point where I have a good amount of it figured out, before, you know, because I don't want to be making like as many changes in the very first round, if that makes sense.
Right.
However, what happened with both Tale of Ord and with this game, after I handed off the first chapter to my first tester, who is always my first tester now because he just gives me really valuable feedback, and is also able to tackle puzzles in their rawest form. And it's not easy to do that because they always start out being harder than you think they're going to be.
Totally.
Yeah, so when he took a first pass at the first chapter, and then I was like, oh, I see. Here are all the big problems with this. So then it kind of completely, rearranged where a lot of the things were sitting.
Mm.
And kind of in this particular case, I had some things planned for like chapter 1 and chapter 2. So I ended up totally mashing them both together.
Mm.
And yeah, so once I try to iterate between every playtest just based on whatever feedback I'm getting.
Mm-hmm.
And once I get it to a point where the puzzle is like pretty good, and by that I mean people can solve it without really needing help, or at least it's like getting close to that point where all I really need to do is like smaller tweaks.
Mm.
Then I started doing the final artwork for it, because it does make a really big difference what the actual visuals look like, and especially in the puzzles in this game, because a lot of them are really visual. And I know that sometimes little details can totally throw you off of something, so I
Yeah.
wanted to make sure that like it would be well tested with the final artwork so that there wouldn't be anything confusing for people. um so yeah, and then once that was kind of getting done, it was comes down to smaller tweaks where it was just like, oh, I have to change this color, or I need to change the wording in this clue because somebody got tripped up like
Mm.
on this one particular word, and then it just completely threw them off track. So I don't want
Mm.
that to happen. So let me try and figure out how I can reword it so it's not going to be confusing. So things like that.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes to me through doing this for a couple of years is you can't not play test a puzzle. No matter how
Oh
simple
yeah.
it is, no matter how good you think you are at making a puzzle that anyone can play, you just can't not play test. No one is so smart that they can think outside their own sort of way of looking at the world. And playtesters are awesome at showing you things that you could never have thought of in terms of interpretation of how you make puzzles and experiences. How long is that something that you do from the very beginning? It sounds like it you play test as you design and create, and it's
Not really. I think I started playtesting in the fall. So actually the game was like getting close to being done by that point.
when you say
Um
fall, what month is that?
I think I started in like maybe October
Yeah,
or
right.
something, or I don't know, somewhere around there.
Yeah, right.
Anyways, but yeah, so I'd already been working on it for like almost, yeah, for like a year at least
Mm-hmm.
before that. So there was a lot of like writing and puzzle development and iteration before I even got it to anyone to playtest. And then after the first playtest, I took like another month to change up a bunch of stuff, and
Mm.
then started. Then I did a lot of playtesting within like 3 months. There were some weeks where I was doing a playtest like every other day.
That's awesome. You have a good community. You have I guess people interested in sitting and working at your games.
Yeah, I've got a good number of puzzle friends. So
Nice.
and after they were took some passes at it, then I gave it to some people that had a little bit less puzzle experience,
Hmm.
just to kind of see how it would be from that end of things, so that they wouldn't be too challenging for
Mm.
somebody who wasn't as experienced with these types of games in particular.
Hmm.
So that also gave me a lot of valuable feedback, and trying to adjust it in a way that wouldn't make it too easy for people, but would still make sense to somebody who was maybe more of a beginner.
Yeah, and that's important to me as well. Like my position in the world is I would love to make, puzzle experiences for people who aren't avid puzzlers, because that's who I am. I enjoy, despite being called the puzzle maker, I'm not a huge when I buy experiences, I like being able to play them and not having that frustration of like, I never would have solved that, or finding out that I had to know all of this like information prior.
Yeah.
That's just like, well, I just didn't get that education. So then I miss out on the fun of the puzzle. And so playtesting with people who don't necessarily play a lot of puzzles is like the best. I love it. I take my I like to take my puzzles. I have a few friends who I used to say, "Hey, would you mind playing my puzzle and like letting me know what you think?" And then they just would never get around to it. They didn't want to. And I discovered the trick was to say, "Hey, I think there's something wrong with this. Can you find what is wrong with it?" And then like they would get back to me instantly. Like, here is everything that's
Wow.
wrong with it. And it's like, thank you very
That's
much.
so interesting.
Yeah, and I was talking about this yesterday to another person who was on the show. That people love to help, and if they think they can help, um, then they will. And add on top of that, people love to know, be smart.
Hmm.
Which reminds me of a really popular, like a philosophy now that I go by when making my puzzles, because I went down the wrong way with this, which was a good puzzle makes the player feel smart, whereas a poorly designed puzzle makes the puzzle designer feel smart. And
I would hope that a good puzzle would also make the designer feel smart.
yes, yeah, yeah, just by
No, but I get it. I
happenstance. But
totally get
yeah,
it. There's definitely a certain inclination to make difficult puzzles, and I think I had I felt more strongly about that before, but like once you really see people playing, you want them to have fun, so you don't want to make it frustrating. It's
mm,
just like, what's the point of doing it then? And sometimes that just means making it a little bit easier, but the truth is, like, easier doesn't necessarily mean easier. It just means better designed, more comprehensive to a person.
yeah,
So, like, because in some cases you could just, throw something in front of somebody and be like, okay, solve this, and it has no information or no instructions or nothing really to kind of pull on.
hmm,
And so it's very easy to just look at it and be like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. And then you just walk away. And because there's there's nothing to grab onto, and there's nothing sadder than walking away from a puzzle.
yeah, absolutely. And I have experienced that recently with something I was playing, and I was just me and my partner were racking our heads over it and looking at it from all these different angles, and we went, fine, we'll take the clue. And we looked at the clue, and the clue was, you need to look this up on Google. And it's
Oh
just
no.
like, there was nothing to imply, in my opinion, that this was a game to be played in conjunction with looking up on a computer.
Hmm.
And it's like, wow, a simple, like, just knowing that going in, that, use clues, use your wits and savvy, or some instruction as to who I was in the game and my relationship to the puzzle. That, only through getting the clues did we realize, oh, okay, we're pretending to be detectives in the real world, and we have to use all of the resources around us. The puzzle
Hmm.
is not self-contained purely within
Right.
this thing. And it was just one of those things that it was frustrating to find that out. It's like, oh, because you then feel like, if I had known that, I would have gotten it. And now it's just sort of like, the secret answer was actually just a bit of a slap or a bit of a trick.
Yeah.
And I think that's an awesome quote. And probably I'll try and make it the title of this episode, which is easier just sort of means better design. Players bring their own difficulty to puzzles sometimes. Like, and I've found it really useful when designing puzzles. I sort of pivoted away from making riddles to now they're just instructions. Like, go here, do this, and try and find the answer. And then so people, and I used to think that would be too easy. People like, I don't want to be told what to do, but actually they sort of do. And it's like, oh, if I just find what this means and find what this means, then I'll find, what the answer is. And through playtesting, discovered that people go, hey, I solved it. In
Hmm.
the same way that you might say after you've followed the instructions to build a piece of IKEA furniture, that you solved the furniture. It's like, yeah, you followed the instructions and you did what they told you and you built a piece of furniture, and it was very satisfying.
Well, I don't know if I 100% agree with that, because I usually don't necessarily love instruction puzzles, but I think it really depends on the puzzle and it depends on the context.
Right.
Like, because with a lot of puzzles, part of it is figuring out what you're supposed to do. And once you figure that out, that's like a really nice aha moment because you figured out something that you're not being told.
Right.
Like there's certain puzzles where you're told the rules and the puzzle is using those rules to solve the problem. So like, like a crossword or a Sudoku or a logic puzzle,
Mm.
like a logic puzzle doesn't usually have an aha moment. You're just trying to piece together this information and figure out how to extract actually what you need from it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's definitely a lot of, a lot you can do with the ahas of figuring out how two things go together or like what you're supposed to do. But it doesn't mean that it has to be totally opaque. Like
Mm.
there are, like I was saying, there are some puzzles that have no instructions and you look at it, you don't know what to do. But there's a way to give instruction without necessarily giving like actual step-by-step instructions,
Right.
right? And I try to do that a bit more these days and try to kind of give instruction by giving example. And I think you could see that in a few of the weekly puzzles that I posted
Mm-hmm.
recently. So like the wheelchair thing, for example, if I hadn't put the actual wheelchair there, it would have been harder to figure out what to do because you didn't have even one piece
Mm.
of the puzzle pieces that you were missing. So if you look at something and kind of try to notice some kind of pattern or like one step is already given to you, you can look at it and see, okay, well, why does this step happen like this? And
Mm.
how can I take the rest of these things and use the same procedure to achieve the result that I want? Like, what is the process that it's trying to describe to me? And you can make those indicators visual as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I can really resonate with that on the puzzle that you made that was like, was it a dome? No, I think it was the octagon
I
that
think
had
that
all
was a pentagon. There was another
pentagon.
puzzle with an octagon. I like shapes.
Shapes are cool, man. I've recently transitioned from a triangle to a hexagon. Um, yeah, the one that had the 5 letters, the different colors, and the pentagon was all sort of cut up into different shapes.
Oh, the
So
shapes one was an octagon. Sorry.
that was the yeah, that was the
I
octagon.
thought you were talking about the wheelchair.
Oh right, yeah, no, the octagon one, and then at the top they were
Mhm.
like the Tetris type looking things.
Yeah.
I resonate with what you just said because I looked at that and just saw all different sorts of information, and initially was like, what is like, I'm not going to be able to solve this, but I stuck with it, and at some point, and I can't really describe it, I just sort of like it started to make sense, like but very slowly, and then you test, you have a theory, I guess. Your brain sort of
Mhm.
goes, well, maybe this shape can be found in here and something to do with the color is, and then all of a sudden you're like, hey, I'm getting somewhere. And so I can resonate. And I think that that's probably something I struggle with in puzzle design is being able to, like, there's no instruction on that one, but if you look at it and just digest it, and maybe there's some patience with it, something starts to, you start to understand it. It's not just all random noise anymore. There's like, okay, there's probably some order here somewhere. Where is it? And then it's reaffirmed by you actually get somewhere with it. Um,
Yeah.
that's a unique style, and it makes me excited to play the Emerald Flame in August next year.
Hopefully sooner.
Yeah,
I think it will be sooner, but it's just who knows with the world right now.
yeah, right.
I didn't
Uh,
want to make any promises I can't keep.
yeah, totally. I think it's, and look, it's going to sound so much better when you're like, hey, I said August, but you could be earlier.
Yeah.
But having said that, we could all be driving around in Mad Max cars soon. So we just don't
I
know.
hope not, but
Yeah.
you're not wrong.
um, so we'll start to wrap it up because we're just about hitting just over an hour. But quickly tell us, the game is done. The Kickstarter is you're in full swing with the Kickstarter at the moment. We will release this episode while the Kickstarter is still active. So anyone listening now, you can still go and pledge. Encourage you to do so. What was your process of scale? So obviously you can make one. How do you go about creating 100 of them?
So for this game, I knew that I wanted to make it at a larger scale, which would mean manufacturing it by an actual, factory. So I did try to design the components in a way that it would be possible to manufacture at scale. And there are a couple times where I may have miscalculated, and they are actually quite difficult to
Hmm.
manufacture at scale, but they are going to happen. So one way or another, the excellent people at Panda are helping me figure it out.
Cool.
So yeah, but that was definitely something that I was thinking about in the design as I was making the pieces, because a lot of the things in the Tale of Ward were really handmade, and like it wouldn't have been possible to make them in any other way.
Hmm.
So it was something I was trying to actively avoid.
And so, with when you say you're keeping it in mind, what does that mean? Does that mean you're constrained to A4 paper, or are you having one company bulk print and then another company sort of like work with a packing company, or what does that process look like with?
It's all gonna be made by one company, but they have different vendors that they might source certain
Right.
components from, because they are board game manufacturers. So there are a few components in this game which are very much not normal board game components. So they'll be sourcing those from other places, but they're gonna be assembling everything.
Cool.
In terms of constraints, I just mean like there's nothing that's so insanely labor intensive, like a wooden puzzle box,
Mm.
like in the Tale of Ward,
Right.
that I had to assemble myself. So I mean, if I was gonna try to have someone else do that, I wouldn't be able to offer the game at a more affordable price, which is also one reason why I wanted to get it manufactured, is just to be able to bring down the price so that more people would actually be able to play it.
Right. And it looks like plenty of them are, more to come, hopefully.
Yeah.
How much longer, at time of we're recording this on this 5th of June, how much time does
Still the
the camp?
fourth where I am, but
Oh, right, that's right. I'm in the future.
I think we've got about 20, 21 days. Yeah, it's the
21
last day is
days.
the 26th, so about 3 weeks left.
Wow. Well, it's going to be an interesting journey to see how high this goes, because you're already at, like, I think last time I saw, which was yesterday, or maybe the day before, 300% funded.
Yeah, I think we're getting closer to 400 now, so it's pretty
Nice.
amazing.
Well done. Well, that must be a validating feeling that your hard work is paying off. And thank you for coming onto the show. Let's wrap it up. Tips and tricks for anyone who wants to create a puzzle experience for themselves. Can you, let's say someone has just decided, hey, I have a great idea for a story. I want to turn it into a puzzle narrative. Where should they start?
Well, I think one important thing to ask at the very beginning is who you're making this puzzle for, who your audience is, because that's going to affect a lot of the decisions that you make along the way, including, what sort of things you include in it, or how you go on making it at all, what kind of difficulty is it going to be, and basically, like, who you want your player to be, how are you going to make a game that that person is going to enjoy.
Right.
The other things that I would say is try to use your strengths to make a game that only you can make, because everybody's got something that they're really good at, and you should use those skills and allow them to shine in the things that you're making, because that's really what's going to make it special. And really just try to make a game that you would want to play, because if you think it's fun, then probably other people will too.
Yeah, there's 7 billion people on the planet. If you like something, then there's going to be at least 1,000 people in the world who also like that thing. I think that's all at the very least, and 1,000 people. And if your thing is $10, then that's $10,000. So, I know I keep trying to wrap this up, but you keep reminding me of things. I've spoken to some other people, so I've had some other guests on the podcast, Chris being one of them, the Society of Curiosities people, Yasina, Michelle, another. And that has come up as well, of like, it's easy to sort of look at what other people are making and think, man, that is so cool. I wish I could have done that. And like they were saying that about your stuff. Yeah.
Nice.
And the conversation then became a thing of like, yeah, well, we all have these special skills, and when we apply what we can do, then yeah, like the idea is, oh, I want to make something cool like that, but I want to do my own thing. Like I want to, and the Emerald Flame is a really good example of what your skills are and how you've applied them accurately. And so it is a bit of an inspiration to us, to say, do what you can do and shine in your own light, and you'll be able to create something that no one else can do, that stands on its own and that stands sort of like out from everything else out there. So thanks for coming on, Rita. It's a pleasure to meet you. And
thanks so much.
Yeah, good luck with the Kickstarter.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Fictional Reality. Up next, we will have another guest. That guest is going to go by the name of Society of Curiosities, I believe. Don't quote me on that. I'm getting a bit mixed up. But we will have more guests, more puzzle makers, more escape room designers, experienced designers, extraordinarily cool and talented people. If you enjoyed this and you're interested, please check out the links below. Head over to PostCurious, head over to the Kickstarter. As of release of this, if it's on a podcast platform, there's only like 2 days left. So get in the Kickstarter now. If you're watching it on YouTube, that's probably a little bit longer left. 26th of June is the cutoff there. Otherwise, like and subscribe. Let us know what you think. If you're an experienced designer who wants to be talked to about designing experiences, hit me up. Or follow me on the old Instagram or Facebook or any of them. I'm on all of them. I even have a TikTok. Oh gosh, golly. That's about it from me, everyone. Arrivederci.